The Tradition of Abuse by Tim Parker. I once knew a man raised in an abusive household. He served during the Vietnam War and returned home a very angry and disillusioned man. He married and had children of his own. As a business owner, he berated, belittled, and degraded many of the people who worked for him. At times, he was capable of being a warm and caring person. At other times, you could witness his short temper, his rage, his wrath, and his resentment. And you could hear it in his voice as well as see it in his eyes. He was beyond reason at times. On more than one occasion, I witnessed him coldly take his frustration out on other people. Though I'm not here to criticize him, he'd obviously been the victim of abuse and was still struggling with inner demons. When I think of him, I think of how he's a prime example of how often abused people thoughtlessly carry on the tradition of abuse by abusing others as he was abused. Having suffered abuse, you'd think such a person would be aware of the hurt and the pain and long-lasting damage that result from abuse, and that they wouldn't want to grow up to become an abuser themselves. Sadly, somewhere along the way, I think they misguidedly begin to actually believe abuse and violence is normal, acceptable, and even useful. Instead of making a commitment to end the cycle of abuse, they in turn promote it and even praise it as a means of keeping people in check. How sad it is that people should loathe one another, have no mercy or compassion for one another, and treat one another as dogs to be whipped into obedience. Think of all the abuse women tolerated over the eons, demonized, degraded, dehumanized, unappreciated, expected to be obedient and subservient at all times under all conditions, exploited, and often physically, emotionally, and psychologically abused. Look at how nations, empires, and great personal fortunes were built on the inhumane practices of serfdom, indentured servitude, outright slavery, and wage slavery, by landowners, slave masters, tycoons, and industrialists, who had no qualms working or beating people to death, breaking up families and treating people as mere property, sending people to work in the most deplorable and unsafe work conditions. Since time immemorial, citizens, brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters have been sent to fight wars and suffer the cost of these wars, that in most cases were only politically justified and rarely, if ever, benefited the people who actually did the fighting, killing, and dying. The gates of Auschwitz read, "Work will set you free." But the victims who labored and died working in such concentration camps never received the reward they were promised for their labor. They didn't receive justice, only cruel treatment and perverse torture. And if they were fortunate, a quick and painless death. Think of the immigrant or the homosexual or lesbian, nearly beaten to death and left for dead, and their only crime was being different. How fearful they must live because we live in a world that turns a blind eye to these immoral acts of violence, and in doing so, silently condone the irrational hatred. Truthfully, we live in a world that condones and supports these acts of abuse. It's how some people assert their power and try to force their will upon others, but there's nothing humane or ethical about it. Some people even make an extremely lucrative fortune off promoting violence and perpetuating abuse. They promote it and glorify it on television and in movies. The fact is, our society has become so desensitized to inhumane treatment and human suffering. We don't even recognize it or acknowledge it when we witness it. Some people in the marketing industry jokingly say the idea of peace sells, but it's still not as profitable as war or crime. I pity two groups of people the most: the victims of abuse and the people who are so ill-exposed to other human beings that they are incapable of seeing the good in others, which causes them to loathe their fellow human being and in turn lose their humanity. This is the wicked cycle of abuse. This is why people not born into privilege and wealth have long suffered cruelties and unfathomable abuse. This is why some men have no scruples and are eager and delighted to pay the people who work for them less than a living wage, with no benefits and no form of job security. This is why we turn a blind eye to the homeless and shrug off the realities of the impact poverty has on our fellow human beings. This is why other people, religious or ethnic minorities, are used as political scapegoats. This is why we ostracize the unemployed but do little to ensure that every human being has the opportunity and access to work so that they can be self-sufficient. This is why the impoverished elderly face the end of their life with hardship and uncertainty. We have a choice. Either we can perpetuate the traditions of abuse, the traditions we witnessed growing up or were possibly victims of ourselves, or we can find it in our hearts to commit ourselves to ending this cycle of abuse and exploitation. The choice you make could have a significant effect on your own life and the people who you hold dear, and also the lives of people who you don't know and can't see. Your choice could be the difference between a reality and future nobody wants to imagine, and a reality and future that people all over the world for generations have dreamed of and waited for, and died waiting for and working for. The hope that their children and the children of others would not have to live a life in which they were denied real opportunity and the chance to never know the bondage and servitude their parents suffered and were so deficiently compensated for.